So we're in the 16th chapter of the book of Romans, and it is a list of personal greetings. And closed by a doxology. I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, and also a deacon of the church at Cenchrea. Now, the word is deacon, as I explained last week. There was no word for a female person serving in that capacity. So Paul uses the masculine word because that's all there was in Greek. And I find a great deal of confusion about deacons in the church. The best way to define a deacon is to say it's a person appointed for special service by the church. And evidently, early on, good morning, early on, the churches selected a permanent body of deacons. And at first, it seems like it was in the 6th chapter of Acts, where there was a special need and the church selected a group of people. It doesn't call them deacons, but it said they deaconed. They used the verb form of it. And but by the time that you get to the book of Romans, and especially the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, evidently every church had a body of deacons. And some of them were women. I'm going to try to bring that out in my translation of 1 Timothy. I'm ready to do that right now in my translation. Okay, so Paul is telling the church at Rome about a group of people that he wanted them to greet. Now, you're in a bind when you try to translate the word greet, because in many cases it means make welcome or be hospitable toward. But you can't tell unless you know a lot more about the New Testament church than I do, and I'm not sure anybody knows enough to be sure which way it ought to be translated. So just greet. And the Greeks were a lot like the Hawaiians are today. You say aloha when you meet somebody, and you say aloha when you leave somebody. And so the word that's translated greet includes both of those ideas. So if you can think of a good English word that does all that other than greet, I'm open. I'll buy it from you for a penny. But so keep that in mind when he's talking about here. One of the ways that the church became or kept together as a unity across the wide range of the Roman Empire, from east to west and from north to south, was by exchanging letters and by traveling evangelists or missionaries going about. And they would carry letters of introduction, just kind of like a modern letter of introduction. And that's what this does. It cements the harmony of the church. This is to introduce to you Phoebe. That would be a good way to think about it. And she was not only a deacon in the church at Sancrea. He said, I beg you to give her a Christian welcome, as the saints should. We ought to welcome all Christian believers that travel and come. I remember a delightful experience I had in Nevada. Not Echo, can't think of the name of it now, but there was a man who was a pharmacist in the little town, and he was a Basque in ancestry, and the only Basque I've ever met. He spoke the Basque language, but he fluent English too, and he taught a Bible class, and I learned something from that Bible class that I had not learned from all of the professors of theology, and he did it just by studying the Bible carefully. And I remember Elko, that's it, Elko, Nevada. And so we went to lunch with the family, and I learned quite a bit about the way the Basque. His father was still a Basque shepherd who had a kind of like a RV, only it was a wagon drawn by mules, that where he'd go out, set up his camp, and then have a flock of sheep that he cared for right by himself. So that gave me a little flavor of what it was like during the New Testament times. There's one thing about it. We've been all over the country and a good part of the world. We've never been deep into Asia or to Australia or New Zealand, but pretty well the rest of the world. And we find that Christians are very hospitable, all kinds. Remember being down in southern Mexico on 3 different occasions, and we would go to these little tiny Indio congregations, some of which you could not drive closer than 2 miles to. You'd have to get out and walk. And they had their little church buildings in the jungle, split bamboo vertically on the walls, and banana leaf thatch on the roof. And you were just welcomed, and they were happy to see you, and just happy people. And we need that in the church today. You see, that's what we do a little bit. It's about as much as we can do, is when, you greet one another and shake hands with them. One thing I always do where I sit, where mine and I sit, I go back and welcome the cameraman, only it was a woman today on the camera, because they kind of get left out of that. And I've always had the feeling that maybe I ought to fill in where people are left out.
When I was in Bible college, we used to go on choir tours to churches, and it was always the best part of the choir tour was staying in people's homes overnight. And that was great fellowship after a choir concert.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead to this. Assist her in any matter in which she has need of. Do this because she's been a patron. Now you notice I capitalized the word patron in the translation. If you are Hispanic background, you will know a little bit more about the patron relationship than us gringos, but it is, even there, it's not the same relationship that they had in the Greco-Roman culture. A patron or patron, they didn't put the long O sound to it. A patron actually was a person who was wealthy enough to open their home for a house church and bear all the expenses that were necessary for that house church to meet. So she was well-to-do. She had a house that had a meeting room in it, big enough that 30 to 50 people, maybe more, could meet in. Now, very few people in that time had houses that big. The typical house of the time had 2 rooms in it, and the whole house could be put inside of this classroom with 7 or 8 feet on all sides of it, and it wouldn't be the, pardon me, it's probably more exasperating to you and irritating than it is to me. But, so, this was a special woman. Now, the reason I emphasize this is that there's a great deal of controversy and misunderstanding about the place of women in the church. And there's been misinterpretations and misunderstandings and imposition of social norms upon the text of the Bible. And I'm trying to clear up some of those by emphasizing this. As I've already told you, that in the matter of worship, women are priests as much as men are. Peter says we're all priests. All believers are priests. A kingdom of priests, he says in 1 Peter. And therefore, a woman in worship can do anything that a priest would do. Now that is, the elders asked me to write a position paper as they were making some decisions about 2.5, 3 years ago. And so I wrote exactly what I have told you here. And so we have women, especially the wives of elders, who, when the elder gets up to give a genuine pastoral prayer, they join them. Not all women who are wives of the elders feel comfortable with that. And in line with Paul's teaching in the 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians, if you can't do it wholeheartedly and feel good about it, then don't do it. And that gives us a flexibility to let people who are gifted in ministering, praying, opportunity to do it, and people, women, even men. We would not force a man to do anything in public worship he didn't feel comfortable doing. Because if worship has any meaning at all, it is an expression of one's personal ideas and commitments to God. And to extort that, that's one thing that I'm so very unhappy with Muslims, is that they think that they're very legalistic and they're going to force you to convert. And the thing is, if you have to force somebody to convert to your religion, it's not very attractive to them. And I've had some discussions. When we were, the last couple of years we were in Northern Virginia, a mosque was built right across the street. And I got to know the man that they called the president of the mosque real well. I gave him an Arabic translation of the New Testament, and he gave me a beautiful Quran. Well, it was beautifully done. And if I had stayed there, he offered to allow me to attend their classes in Arabic that I wish I'd had time to do, to learn enough Arabic to get by. I never would have been fluent in it, but we moved. Okay, that's what Phoebe was, a patron. And as I said, don't you who have a Hispanic background think that it means exactly what a patron means, but that is and the patronship in Spanish culture is derived from what the patron in the Roman Empire meant.
It's especially used in the time of weddings. There would be different patrons for different parts of the wedding, as far as the dress, the different things that would be done by different patrons.
Yes, I've been to a wedding in what's the church they called St. Joski's, right within St. Joseph's, yeah. And they had 24 couples in the wedding party, and each one provided something. They did the yoke, the white rope yoke, and then they did the dollar dance at the reception. Really enjoyed it. I love to participate in other cultures. Let's go on. Greet Priscilla and Aquila. Now, this is an unusual couple. They were Jewish tent makers. And again, it helps us understand the place of women in the New Testament church. The first time that Luke mentions this couple, he says it's Aquila and Priscilla. But every time after that, and every time Paul mentions them, the woman's name comes first. And especially is this true where it says in the book of Acts, 19th chapter, I think, where it says Priscilla and Aquila took Apollos aside and taught him the way of the Lord more perfectly. And there lets us know that Paul's prohibition against teaching, women teaching men, is not what many of us think that it is. It's hard to translate. I'll tell you how I translated that passage. He says, I do not allow a woman to dominate a man under the guise of teaching. Do you hear how I said that? That's getting what's called a hendiadys. And those of you who've been in the class will be familiar with that term. It's two Greek adjectives joined together by conjunction. And it doesn't mean two separate things. It means the resultant of those two. And it's dominate by teaching, or teaching by something like that. That's the best I could do to translate it. Here it says, my fellow workers in the cause of Jesus Christ, who risked their lives to save mine. Now, would I love to know what that means? I don't. I know what the words mean, but I don't know anything about the occasion. But it is Paul expressing his thanksgiving to them. I suspect that this might have happened in Ephesus. We do know that in Ephesus, Paul was exposed to fighting beasts in the theater, because he tells us it in another one of his epistles. But whether that's the event or not, I don't know. But notice how intertwined the New Testament church was. Even though they were outnumbered thousands to one, there were many thousands of Christians. At the time Paul wrote this letter, there's no way to know how many Christians there were.
Is it safe to say that these names were not unfamiliar to his listeners or to whom he was writing? That they were known names?
Yes.
Known people?
Yes, and he wants them to be known to everybody. They were known in some churches and maybe not at Rome yet. Okay. Not only I, but also all the churches of the Gentiles thank them. They were what's called peripatetic. I mean, they traveled a lot, probably due to the fact that as Jews, I know they were thrown out of Rome by Claudius's decree, and that's where Paul met them in Ephesus. But they probably went to other places, and Paul wanted them recognized. Now, I'm talking a whole lot, and a lot of you are beginning to look kind of glassy-eyed. So I want to get a little feedback from you. What does all of this mean to you? Anybody? What?
All of what?
What we're doing here, what we're talking about.
Oh. Well, it's just kind of, it's the people that have been in Paul's life that he wants people to look up to.
Okay, that's good. Anyone else except Jesse?
Except Jesse.
Well, it seems to me that there were people that were well known within that church community, so it might give us insight as to how well knit the church community was.
Very good observation.
They held they used their house, they kind of worked behind the scenes. They weren't like, I guess evangelists behind the scenes.
Okay, we're going to get to that, yes.
I was thinking of how he seems to try to be elevating them, individuals for recognition purposes.
Yes. There is a sense in which all Christians are equal.
Yeah.
But as George Orwell's Animal Farm said some animals are more equal than others. It was the pigs that said that. That's literally true.
And they're smart.
Yeah. But that is what he was. He was an ex-communist who was fed up with the totalitarian tendencies of communism of the time. Okay.
I had a question about this. He's saying to greet these people now. Are they in Rome, or is he saying to greet them and they're not actually in Rome at the time? But he's saying that are they coming to Rome?
They might.
Yeah.
Now, that's a very good question. Paul is writing here about people who moved around in the churches and who might be expected to visit Rome. You know the old saying, all roads lead to Rome? Well, at the time that Paul wrote this, that was almost literally true. If you get a map of the Roman roads, they radiate out from the center of Rome. Milepost 0 in all of the Roman roads was in Rome. And roads really led to Rome. And Rome always was a magnet for people. So I would say that Paul expected or had a reason to anticipate that they might end up in Rome. And he always had this thrust in his teaching that all Christians ought to accept one another. See, this is just a theme that we've already seen in the book of Romans. Accept one another as Christ has accepted you. Don't see Jews and Gentiles. Don't see black men from North Africa or blonde Saxons from Central Germany or whatever. See a Christian. There's neither bond nor free, male nor female. We are all acceptable to Christ on the same basis.
That's a great encouragement to be accepted everywhere. You know, you don't feel like you're left out. You're a part of a greater family.
I remember when we started, when we moved from Texas to the Boston area, a lot of people said, "Oh, I wouldn't do that." Said, "They're the coldest people in the world." We got to our house at 29 Abbotsford Road, and our furniture didn't. And we called the moving company, and they didn't even know where the van was. What had happened, the van driver was going to come within 50 miles of his home on the way to Boston, and he decided it was time that he spent some time at home, so he just, without telling the dispatcher or anything, he just turned off the main highway and went home and stayed there a week. And and we were in a house that was being remodeled and didn't even have facilities for taking a bath. And our youngest daughter, who never saw a stranger, went to the people next door and told them, you know, all this. So they said they invited us over for a meal and then to use their bathing facilities. So, and that's the way it was. And I'm just showing you that being accepted is a happy thing. And we even got a cat from the people living on the other side of it. It was Elaine and David, can't think, but his name, his name was Ben Gurion. Not Ben Gurion like the premier of Israel was, but his first name was Ben, and of course they were Jewish. And so Terry said, that's our youngest daughter, said, call that cat until the cat died. That was her Jewish cat. I don't know how you could tell a Jewish cat from a Gentile cat. But I'm just showing you how that I'm emphasizing what you said, Jesse. It is good to be accepted. And if you go out of your way to be accepting, people, the majority of people will respond positively. Now you get some old mousebacks and people that they don't like themselves, so they don't like anybody else either. And you just have to stay clear of them. But don't let it keep you from welcoming people. Okay. Not only I, but also all the churches of the Gentiles thank them. Greet also the church which meets in their home. Now, the only place that we know that Christians met for the first 100 to 200 years of the existence of the church was in individual homes. Now, somebody will remember about the school of Tyrannus in Ephesus, but that was a public hall, and they met there by courtesy of the owner of the school or whatever the
That
hall.
patron.
What?
By courtesy of that patron.
Yes, that's right. Greet my dearly loved Epinetus, who was the first person in the Roman province of Asia to become a Christian. This is, just think, been close to 2,000 years. And this is the first person kind of outside of Jerusalem, Samaria area, Antioch, that became a Christian. Wouldn't that be a badge to have? You first person outside of Israel to become a Christian. Okay. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives and fellow prisoners. Now, he wrote this from prison. Where he was imprisoned, we don't know. It wasn't in Rome. This could have been written the 2 years that he was in prison in Caesarea Maritima, waiting for a boat to take him to Rome. That's what most scholars think, but you can't prove it.
Charles, on
Yeah.
verse 6, greet Mary. Do we know which Mary that was?
No.
Okay.
Common name.
Yes.
I just wondered if we...
No, and there's no use speculating, because Mary or Miriam was the most common name among Jews of the time, female name. There's at least, I believe at least 5 Marys mentioned in the New Testament. And this one might make the 6th one.
NIV says 6.
What?
I mean, the NASB says 6.
6, okay. Well, I'm closer than I thought I
Well,
was.
you said 6. You said you made the 6, so that's good.
But it had to be someone that was known by them, because it says that she has done so much on their behalf.
Yes. The word here is very good. Worn herself out. It means engaged in grinding toil. Evidently, she provided support to Paul and the missionaries. You know that the book of Luke, and we'll study this when we study the gospel, mentions some women by name that traveled with the apostles from Galilee. That doesn't sound very unusual to us, but the people in the Greco-Roman world would have been scandalized. This just was not done. They think about them a lot like people would think about groupies that would travel with a rock band. That's just about the level of shock they would have had. And these were not women of loose morals. One of them was the wife of the steward of Herod's household, mentioned by name. But we cannot really understand, folks, how revolutionary Christianity was when it was spreading in the Greco-Roman world. Just to get some of it one time, I was trying to bring this point home. And I said, and this was back in the 70s, I said it would be like somebody coming to San Antonio today and say that there was a black man electrocuted in Huntsville, risen from the dead, And now the only way you can be saved is believe in his name. Now remember, that was the 70s. And that's about what a shock some of this would have been to them.
For that time, weren't women really considered almost like property? Or not, I mean, they didn't have the same
Well,
man.
I'll tell you what, it's according to where you were. In Greek culture, yes. Jewish culture was mixed, but Roman culture, women could own their own property. Now, they had to be real careful in other ways. But let's just go on
I have
now.
a question.
Okay?
On 7, it says, my kinsmen and fellow prisoners, so do we know what the relationship was?
No.
Okay, and then in this Bible, it's saying that Junius, how do you say that?
Junius.
Junius is feminine.
Yes, it is.
So is there any indication that that's husband and wife?
Not directly. By coupling their names together, they could have been Paul's cousins or something like that.
Okay.
But
Taking the gender into consideration, the fellow prisoners, what was would men and women be incarcerated or they could be if it were like house arrest or something?
well, they could have been in the same prison. They wouldn't have been in the same
Cell block.
cell block.
Okay.
Okay. You put your finger on something, JT. This section of Romans raises more questions than 100 scholars could answer. There's been PhD dissertations. There's been much ink spilled and talking about every one of these people. It's a part of the epistle to the Romans that many commentators just gloss over. No scholar is comfortable with saying, I don't know. And they have that in common with a lot of preachers. But I have no problem saying I don't know. Because there's what I don't know so far exceeds what I do know that it would be foolish for me not to say I don't know. My sense of propriety and sense of myself is strong enough that I don't have to worry about saying I don't know, because I want to say only what I can be sure of about God. I don't want your faith to depend at all on my limited knowledge. That I would be completely horrified if I thought your faith depended on how much I know or how little I know.
It's an innuendo.
Yeah. So, does that answer your question, JT? I don't know. Okay. They're notable among the missionaries and became Christians before I did. Notice I didn't put an S on that. I think it should have an S. Now, I translated this missionary. I bet your American Standard ASB or NASB says apostles. Does it, JT?
It says in Christ before me.
It doesn't say about missionaries, notable among the missionaries.
Who are outstanding among the apostles.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
Yes. The problem is that the word apostle basically means one sent. and it was used for both the apostles with a capital A or others sent. And I think it's clearly here that these people were not apostles in the sense that Paul was an apostle. Knowing that it can be translated missionary, I think this is one of the places it should be translated missionaries. But there's been people argue, you know, that in the Roman Catholic tradition, where they pass on the idea of apostleship, this is one of the passages they use to say, see here, these people were successors to the apostles. There is not one whit of evidence to support that, except people want it to be that way. One of my pet peeves, of which you know I've got hundreds, are people who decide they want something to be that way and look for every possibility, even if they have to twist the meaning of words and all. Missionary, I feel perfectly comfortable with that translation.
Now, isn't it possible that they could have been, they could have seen the risen Christ? You know, like in 1 Corinthians, it talks about there was 500 witnesses, or
Yes.
I mean, and said that they were in Christ before Paul was.
Yes. The thing is that the only added apostles we know are the ones that took Judas's place in the book of Acts when we studied, and they had not only to have seen the risen Christ, they had to have kept company with the other apostles during the lifetime of Jesus. And that's the reason I don't think these are missionaries. Okay.
What would be the relationship of Paul then to his apostleship, since he wasn't with them? He argues for...
He said, I was a misbegotten
Right, and
apostle. That's the best way. Some people want to translate, I was an abortion of an apostle, which is possible, but I think is going a little too much for the shocking and not enough. Most people translate that in 1 Corinthians 15, I was born out of due season. That's literally what it says. And see, that always made Paul susceptible to being attacked. There were people at Corinth that said he wasn't any kind of an apostle because he didn't meet the qualification. Anybody? I like to get questions. By the way, since you started talking and asking questions, that glazed eyes have gone away. I teach according to the way I see you responding, and I don't want you to look glazed-eyed. I want you to look bright-eyed, as the old saying, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. You know what that describes, don't you? That's a description of a squirrel. And we have two. We've had a mating pair of squirrels in our backyard since 1991 at least. And their generation, I don't know, there's 3 or 4 generations at least of them. And when I'm really want to just relax, I can look out my back picture window in the bedroom and watch them chase each other. And wish I could move like that now. Okay. Greet Ampliatus, whom I dearly love in the Lord. Paul was not afraid to say about both men and women, I love them. And he He talked about the much loved disciple, Timothy. He talks about Barnabas and others that way. Greet Urbanus. Oh, one thing I wanted to tell you about many of these phrases wouldn't be Mary, but Epaenetus, Andronicus, Junia, Andronicus anyway, Ampliatus, Urbanus, Apelles, those were all freed slaves. Because you can tell by their names that they are. And the reason I want to bring that out is that in my translation of the New Testament, one of the difficulties to translate so that people would have the same emotional, spiritual reaction to things is that if you translate the word slave, you will automatically think about slavery in this country. And slavery in the Roman Empire was so completely different that you need some other way to translate the word, because it had no racial significance as it did in this country. It had no significance. Many times a person would be a slave who was much better educated than the person who owned them, and that they would buy a slave to educate their children. So I just don't use the word slave. You'll have to wait and see what I do use. Okay. Greet Urbanus, our fellow worker in Christ, and also greet our dear friend Stachys. That CH is a K sound, as in Christian. Ampliatus, Urbanus, Apelles, who has been tested and found worthy in Christ. Greet those of the household of Aristobulus. By the way, I'm giving the correct pronunciation of these words. I have to stop. What?
Putting the accent on the right syllable?
Yes, I am. Greet Herodian, my relative. Now, what do we know about Herodian just from the name? Anybody?
Some relationship to Herod, the family of Herod.
What would be the relationship?
Either family or household, like a servant or...
He was probably Jew.
Yes. Herodian, I think, is, I'm not sure whether that's male or female. I'd have to go back and check. But probably the person had been a slave in the household of one of the Herods. That's one thing that pre-Civil War slavery and Roman slavery had in common, was that many of the slaves took names of the family to which they belonged. And I'm not sure whether this is male or female. I'm not even going to hazard a guess till I look. Okay. Greet those in the household of Narcissus who are in the Lord. Another slave. Do you know the legend of Narcissus? Where they got the name? Narcissus was a, what?
He was into himself?
Yes, he was. There's a a Greek legend of Narcissus. Narcissus was the son of Apollos and Aphrodite, and was the most beautiful boy child that you ever saw. And he had never seen himself until he was well into his teenage years. And one day he stooped down to drink water in a spring. And for the first time in his life, he saw how beautiful he was. And he became so enthralled that he stayed there until the gods took pity on him and turned him into a narcissus flower. And that's where we get narcissism, meaning inordinate self-love. Be careful, if you love yourself too much, you'll be turned into a flower. What was that, Lindy?
I just said the moral of the story is, but it's not a fable, I know. Sorry.
Well, it's a legend of a demigod,
Right.
to be technical. Okay. Meet Tryphena and Tryphosa, two women who have worked very hard in the Lord's cause. Greet my dear friend Persis, another woman who has worked very hard in the Lord's cause. Greet Rufus, who is of the elect of God, and his mother, who has also been a mother to me. Again, each one of these raises questions that I would dearly love to know about. But this is all the information we have. Now, a few of these people are probably mentioned in extra biblical material. Now, that's a debatable point, whether any of them, because so many of these names are common.
It kind of fulfills the teaching of Jesus when people were asking about his family.
Mm-hmm.
Who is my brother? Who is my sister?
Yeah.
You know, all of them.
Well,
Who are leaders.
And this is the idea here, by the way, Jesse, that these people were as dear to Paul as his own family would have been. Do you remember when Peter asked Jesus, what about us who have left houses and families and everything in your name? And he said, well, you will receive 100-fold in this life. I knew a man who was a native of Nigeria, who when he converted to Christianity, his family threw him out of the family. And he said, I felt very terrible because in Nigeria, family is just everything. And he said, but God did as Jesus promised. He said, now I have 100 mothers and 100 fathers, hundreds of brothers and sisters. And I think that's the theological meaning of this section of the book of Romans. Paul did not marry. He did not have children. He had some distant relatives, but more than that, he had this wide range of friends, men, women, wealthy, ex-slaves, all the way, whatever you want to think about, he had. And that's the way we ought to think about it. As a preacher, at the time mine and I were preaching together, we moved way too much because it was traditional only to stay 2 or 3 years and go move something up. But we never lacked for close friends. We still get letters and cards from people that we knew 50 and more years ago, or their children or grandchildren. One of our elders, Jim Toombs, today told us he had met with some people named Wade Caldwell and his wife. Mina taught Wade in kindergarten in Albany, Texas, in the middle 1960s. And there's, now, they still remember us, and he wanted to make sure that they sent their greetings to us. That's what it means to be fellow believers in Christ.